Welcome everyone to our Guava and Osterman research webinar today. My name is David Atchison and I'm the Senior Marketing Strategist here at Guava. We've got a large number of people on this call today. That's gratifying for us because it indicates that we are all intent on getting a firm grasp on how to deal with this topic that we've entitled Best Practices for Managing Email Archiving. We're always pleased to bring you Michael Osterman from Osterman Research. Under Michael's direction, we will be discussing the reasons for archiving email and how to do it most effectively. Michael is an industry expert. He's the president and founder of Osterman Research. He has over 27 years of experience in the high-tech research industry, and he spent 16 of those years following specifically the messaging and collaboration industries. One item to take note of as we start out here is that there will be our traditional and usual Q&A session at the end of this webinar. As you have questions as we go along, feel free to put them right into the Q&A or the chat section of WebEx anytime, just over there on the right side. We'll make sure that those questions are addressed then, and then we'll also take additional questions at the conclusion. So, ladies and gentlemen, I now give you Michael Osterman. So take it away, Michael.
Well, David, thank you very much, and I'd like to thank everybody who's here today. I definitely agree with David. Archiving is really a critical issue, and it's one that a lot of organizations have problems with. We'll get into the emotional aspects of archiving and so forth, but glad to have all of you here today. For those of you not familiar with who we are, we're really an independent market research and consulting firm that is very focused on any type of communication or collaboration in a workplace context. So, obviously we look at things like archiving, security, content management, encryption, and we have a very strong emphasis on primary research. Although we do analysis, one of the real values that we think we can bring to the table is that we talk to people in the trenches. We talk to IT managers, email administrators, records managers, people who are actually managing this content and have to do something with it on a daily basis. The company was founded in 2001, and we're based near Seattle, Washington. So let's get right into it. One of the things I've done, for example, at in-person events, is really to ask about tax returns. And we all have a relationship with the IRS if we're in the United States, or if you're in Canada, it's the Canada Revenue Agency, or Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs in Great Britain, or wherever you are, you pay taxes of some kind at a federal level, at a state level, local, what have you. So we all are very familiar with the process of filling out tax returns, paying taxes, and so forth. So really consider archiving first from a personal perspective. You complete a tax return. All of us do that in the U.S. It's by April 15th, but, sometimes, multiple times during the year. You complete a tax return, and virtually all of us will make copies of it, and then we file that copy somewhere because somebody has told us to do it. We stick it into a filing cabinet or, put it somewhere where we're going to have access to it in the future. And then after 30 or 60 or 90 days from filing that tax return, most of us don't take that copy out and run it through a shredder and destroy all copies of it. Destroy all vestiges of that tax return we took so much time to fill out. Instead, we preserve that tax return for as long as the law requires us to do it. In the U.S., I believe it's 7 years. Your CPA may recommend a longer period than that. If you're, running a small business, for example, you may have different rules and so forth. But the bottom line is, from a personal perspective, all of us understand the need to archive critical business records. And among the most critical type of business records, obviously, is a tax return. We make a copy of it. We preserve it for long periods. Essentially, we really get archiving. The problem happens when we get into the workplace. Very often, and we do a lot of research on this, as I mentioned, we'll ask organizations, what do you do with your business records that are in email or, maybe in files, what have you? And what we find is that a lot of organizations really don't archive that content. They will keep it around for 30 or 60 or 90 days. They certainly back it up on a nightly basis or maybe every other night. So they do keep copies of it temporarily, but quite often organizations don't preserve their critical business records in email for very long periods of time, for 3 or 5 or 7 years, or indefinitely, as some statutes actually require. Instead, they'll leave it up to individual users to decide what's important, or they'll purge their email system after 2 weeks or a month, what have you, and they're losing a lot of the critical business records that are in email, stuff that they really should be preserving. Now, part of the reason for this is that archiving tends to be, for want of a better term, sort of an emotional subject for a lot of people. People feel that if they preserve business records, things that contain intellectual property, maybe statements of fact from senior managers that might not present the company in the best light in the future, they decide they want to eliminate these smoking guns and get rid of all of the evidence. That we always recommend organizations not do that, because if you are going to be going through a lawsuit or a regulatory audit of some kind, somebody is going to have a copy of your email. And even if you've deleted every single copy of email from backup tapes, from users' desktops, from their smartphones, from the 10 or 15 different locations within your own company where it might reside, chances are somebody on the outside is going to have a copy of that. The people that received that email, the people that have actually archived your own email as a recipient of it, and so forth. So while archiving tends to be sort of an emotional issue for a lot of organizations, it really shouldn't be. It contains business records, and it needs to be treated just like any other business process. So there are really 5 fundamental reasons to archive. Now, the reasons are going to vary, based upon the size of the organization, the industry you're in, your management's risk tolerance, advice from legal counsel, legal precedent, and so forth. But these are 5 reasons that, to varying degrees, will apply to just about any company. The first is litigation, and this we find in our research tends to be the most common reason for archiving. The sort of the top of mind issue for a lot of decision makers as they consider whether or not to manage an archiving system and how they migrate it and so forth. So essentially what we're talking about is that an organization might at some point be a party to a legal action. They either might be named in a lawsuit, or they might be some third party that is involved in a lawsuit in some way. They may have to present evidence. So bottom line is you are at some point going to need to place a litigation hold on data that might be relevant. And that simply means that if you get wind that a lawsuit might be coming, maybe it's a wrongful termination suit, whatever the action might be, you have to stop the normal purge processes within your organization. You have to be able to preserve content that might be relevant. So that means if you have a normal purge cycle of 2 weeks or 30 days, whatever it might be, you have to suspend that for all of the data that might eventually be relevant in that legal action, and for as long as it might be relevant. You might be directly sued, and you might have to go through a discovery process. You need to find and produce specific records, for example, maybe all of the communications on a particular subject from your senior managers to external auditors, or emails that talk about a particular case, a particular individual, maybe the termination of an individual. Basically, anything that might be relevant for presentation in the court would have to be searched and discovered. So sometimes the queries are very complex, and they require searching sometimes through hundreds of millions or even billions of records in some cases, if you're preserving data for a long time, or if you're a very large organization. So essentially, you need an archiving system that will allow you to do both things, to put a hold on data for as long as necessary, and also to go through a sometimes very complex discovery process so that you can find and present that data on demand. Now, the second issue, the second reason to archive is regulatory compliance. And this applies primarily to heavily regulated firms, financial services, pharmaceuticals, energy, healthcare, basically anybody with a very strict set of regulations for preserving content. Financial services probably has the most rigorous set of requirements because of the SEC and FINRA in the U.S., the Financial Services Authority in the U.K., and basically various financial services regulatory organizations throughout the world. those organizations tend to have the strictest requirements, but all of us to some extent have a regulatory requirement to preserve data. Now, one of the things we find in our research is that some organizations believe that if they're in manufacturing or retail or some other quote-unquote non-regulated industry, they don't have a regulatory compliance obligation. And that simply isn't true. All of us are regulated. It's just that some are heavily regulated, some more lightly regulated. For example, in the United States, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission says that personnel records have to be preserved for 1 year. So if somebody sends her supervisor a request for a vacation for the month of August, that constitutes a personnel record, and that has to be preserved for 1 year. Now, the vast majority of these regulations don't say that you have to preserve email in an email format. You could print it out, put it into a filing cabinet, but because so much of the content that we share is electronic and so much of that is through email, it simply makes sense to preserve the records in the native format, simply because it's too expensive and too cumbersome to do otherwise. So bottom line here is that archiving is an essential element in being able to satisfy whatever regulatory compliance obligations you might have. The third issue is storage management, and this gets more into the functional considerations for archiving. Email and a variety of application servers that we have can store just absolutely enormous amounts of information. Email stores, for example, can store multiple gigabytes per user, and if you're dealing with maybe 1,000 or 1,500 users on a server, you're dealing with a lot of information. One of the real advantages of an archiving system is that it can automatically offload that content from those servers to archival storage, but still make it available to end users. So, for example, if you have a rule that says email older than a month or 3 months, or when email stores get to a certain size, that excess content is migrated to an archive. That allows the amount of content stored on the server to be much smaller, so that if you do have a hard disk crash, if maybe a patch goes awry and blows up a server, it's not going to take nearly as much time to restore that server back to a normal operating state. The other big advantage is that the nightly backups that you really have to do take much less time. And one of the things we find in our research is that a lot of administrators really struggle with backups because they simply don't have enough time to back up a server because there is so much content. So from a purely functional standpoint, an archiving system is incredibly beneficial because it's offloading most of the content that you no longer have to back up or restore on a regular basis. So we recommend, even if you don't have a significant regulatory compliance obligation or legal reasons to archive, it's important to archive simply from a storage management perspective. The fourth reason is knowledge management. Information workers in your organization, email users, and so forth create lots of valuable content. And what we find is that it's important to be able to archive that content so that users can go back to old files and see what they told to clients. There's a whole panoply of reasons for archiving this knowledge that your organization creates. You have corporate heritage that you might want to produce, some sort of a digital memory of the organization, and archiving enables you to do that simply by preserving all of the relevant content that you might need for future use of whatever kind. Now, frankly, what we find is that very few organizations will ever deploy an archiving system with knowledge management as the primary driver. Usually it's a secondary or tertiary benefit. Very few actually say, we want to preserve our corporate knowledge just for the sake of having it, so we'll implement an archiving system. And while it is a secondary benefit of having archiving, it's an important one because it's important to be able to preserve all of that content that your users are producing. You're paying them to produce content, and simply throwing it away after 30 or 90 days really just doesn't make any sense. Also, another benefit of archiving is that if you do decide at some point to start doing business analytics, you want to start mining your old content for business intelligence about managing the sales process more efficiently or finding prospects more efficiently, whatever the case is, an archiving system will be a key component in allowing you to do that simply because you've got all of this information preserved in an indexed and organized way. And finally, another key reason to archive is really to improve end user and IT productivity. One of the things we find in a lot of organizations, simply because IT is so stressed and they really just don't have the bandwidth to do everything that users would want them to do, is that IT very often cannot respond to a request to find a missing or a deleted email. Without an archiving system, that tends to be a real pain, because you have to, in some cases in Exchange, for example, set up a recovery server, go into the content and look for information and so forth. And while that's certainly been enabled, more easily with more recent versions of Exchange because of the archive, if you have an older version of Exchange or in another messaging system that doesn't have an archive, that can be a real pain. We found in a lot of organizations that unless it's a senior person asking for the recovery of that missing or deleted email, it simply doesn't happen. And with an archiving system, IT can basically go to end users and say, you can find this content yourself. You can go into your own personal archive, withdraw the information that you need, and you don't have to involve IT at all. So basically, archiving improves end user productivity because now end users have the self-service access to that older content that they need, and IT benefits because they are no longer pestered with requests to find those missing or deleted emails. So really, it's a win-win for both. Now, archiving is certainly evolving. Basically, organizations have to preserve their digital content, what's referred to in the FRCP as ESI, or electronically stored information. And for most organizations, they actually begin with email. It makes sense to start there because what we found in our research is that the typical user spends about 150 minutes a day doing something in their email client. Composing emails, receiving them, looking for content, using an email system as the launch pad for applications, what have you. We also find that the average user sends or receives about 110 emails per day, mostly receiving. So there's a lot of content stored in email, and it simply makes sense for an organization to begin with email. But it really doesn't end there. We recommend that organizations archive their instant messaging content, all of the files that will be relevant, their social media content, basically any content that might be relevant from a regulatory perspective, from a legal perspective, from an end-user productivity perspective, and so forth. And so really archiving is evolving into something that is really much more than email archiving. If you're in the financial services space, for example, you've had to archive social media content since 2010. You've had to archive instant messaging content since 2003, and email since 1997. So organizations that are regulated by the SEC and FINRA are very familiar with archiving a wide variety of content types. That simply isn't the case for a lot of other companies that today, if they archive at all, are usually archiving only email. But we do recommend, getting together with legal counsel, getting together with, peers in the industry and so forth, and really finding out what you're going to need to archive in the future. Just, using social media as one example. A lot of organizations are starting to archive Twitter content, Twitter posts from their employees, or anything that might mention that company that otherwise might be relevant. A lot of organizations, if they are using Facebook in a corporate way, in a formally sanctioned way, are starting to archive Facebook posts. That's becoming relevant from a legal perspective. Periodically, social media content is required as part of the discovery process, and if it is for your organization, you're going to have some way to extract that content to find the context of posts, what have you. So it is critical to really move beyond email as the only source of information that you're archiving. Now, the evolution of archiving is really continuing in the context of migrating from one on-premises archiving system to another, or in some cases migrating from on-premises to the cloud. And what we're finding is that a significant part of the archiving market today is actually a replacement market for organizations that already have an archiving system in place. They've decided that they need to move to that next generation of archiving platform that either provides better performance or is more scalable or is going to be more accessible to users without IT intervention. There are really a variety of reasons to migrate archiving systems, and a big piece of the archiving market today is really organizations that are looking for a newer, better, faster, or somehow a more improved system. And it's important to note that just like storage, archiving is probably going to require more performance and more scalability than you expected it would when you first implemented the archiving system, simply because so much information gets stored. And as I mentioned early on, there are requirements to preserve content for long periods of time. It depends on the content type or the regulatory authority you're dealing with, but usually it's an absolute minimum of 3 years. A lot of content has to be preserved for 6 or 7 years, and in some cases you have to preserve information indefinitely. In the healthcare industry, if you're dealing with toxic substances and so forth, there's lots of content that you have to preserve indefinitely or at least for very long periods of time. And so archives tend to grow beyond what a lot of organizations expect they will. And what we found as well is that when organizations are archiving content and they establish a 7-year timeline for preservation of content, many times they don't have a good deletion strategy. They don't know exactly what they need to delete, and so they end up keeping data even longer than that 7-year period, even though it was initially set up to be deleted after a set period. So it's important to consider that migration is an absolutely critical aspect of really understanding how archiving is evolving. So bottom line is that all organizations should archive their relevant electronic content. There is no such thing as an unregulated industry, so everybody has some sort of a regulatory obligation to preserve content. Just about everybody has a legal obligation. But then from a storage management perspective, it simply makes sense to preserve content to make your systems run more efficiently. If you don't do that, if you don't archive content, you really can run into a variety of, sometimes nasty consequences. There can be legal sanctions, fines, regulatory sanctions, just a variety of consequences that most organizations would find, quite onerous. And archiving really is evolving to include a lot more content types. We always recommend to start with email because it's the largest single source of content that most organizations are going to have to access on a daily basis. But files are a critical aspect of that, social media, what have you. And archiving planning really should include the ability to migrate between archiving providers and to be able to migrate that to the cloud when you need to. Okay, here's our contact information. And David, I think we're going to be getting into some questions now.
Indeed. Thanks so much, Michael. As we get into this Q&A section, go ahead and submit your questions using that side panel. We already have some questions in the queue, and I'll go ahead and ask those of you, Michael. Let's start out with one from Jay. He asks, what parts of an email should we be archiving? Should we be archiving calendars, attachments, folders, appointments, everything, nothing?
Well, it depends to an extent on what you're going to want to do with the information. Certainly, the emails and the attachments themselves should be archived. That's that should be first and foremost for most organizations what they archive out of the email content stream. We also recommend archiving calendar appointments, tasks, contacts, what have you, because that's valuable information as well. So it really depends on what you're going to want to do. From a litigation perspective, it's probably not as critical to archive tasks, for example, more important to archive the emails and the attachments, but it really is going to depend upon the advice of legal counsel. And if you look at the amount of content in an email system, there's a relatively small portion that's accounted for by calendars, calendar entries, tasks, and so forth. So it from a purely functional standpoint, it might make sense to archive that content as well.
Great. This one's from James. I don't like attorneys. How involved do attorneys need to be in this process?
Yeah, he's certainly in good company. I don't think most of us like attorneys all that well, but certainly I think attorneys need to be involved in the context of providing advice on what to preserve and for how long to preserve it. The key driver for most organizations in the context of making an archiving decision is going to be, what you need to preserve and for how long you need to preserve it. And certainly you need to get good counsel from your attorney on that. Your attorneys have to be, well-versed on recent precedents because there are, court cases that might be relevant to your organization or to your industry that may dictate, longer retention periods. One of the advantages of having a very heavy regulatory compliance focus, for example, in the financial services industry, is that the SEC and FINRA will tell you how long to preserve information. You don't have that luxury so much from a legal perspective, because the courts don't have any hard and fast rules for the length of time that you have to preserve content. Usually, if you want to be conservative, archive for longer periods and archive more content, but certainly that's going to be dependent upon the advice of legal counsel.
Okay. What kinds of problems have you seen when organizations migrate from one archive to another?
Well, there's a couple of key considerations. One is just the performance. Migrating terabytes of data can take a very long time, and it just, from a purely functional standpoint, particularly if you're going to the cloud, there can be bandwidth issues and so forth. So a lot of organizations opt to send, CDs or DVDs or tapes, to the archiving provider to have them ingest that into the system. The other issue that probably is even more critical is the potential corruption of data. If data somehow gets corrupted, or if you lose chain of custody somehow, that can be a very serious issue. Because, for example, if you have email that's going to be serving as evidence at some future point in a trial and some sort of a legal action, and you can't demonstrate that the authenticity of that data, if you can't demonstrate that the data was migrated and chain of custody was preserved, then you can run into a whole variety of problems, leading up to the point where you might not be able to use that content as evidence.
Great. Is it more difficult to migrate from an on-premise archive to a cloud archive, or to migrate from an on-premise to an on-premise archive?
I'm not sure it's any more difficult to migrate to the cloud. I think the one of the real issues you have to consider is the bandwidth. Particularly if you're migrating huge amounts of data, online as opposed to some sort of physical delivery. That can be a real issue in migrating to the cloud. But a lot of cloud providers have good ingestion schemes, and they have professional services that will help the organization to migrate that data. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily more difficult to migrate to the cloud, although it could be in some cases.
Thank you. Where can I go to find out more about which government regulations my company should be complying with?
Well, it depends on the industry you're in. Certainly if you're in the financial services industry, you can check out the SEC and FINRA websites. FINRA has a lot of good resources for that. HHS has good data on healthcare-related requirements, the Medicare conditions of participation, the new requirements in the omnibus rule, and so forth. We have published a white paper on regulatory requirements, that touch on some of the key ones. The issue that you're going to have to face is that there are literally thousands of regulations, anywhere from 10 to 14,000 regulations in the U.S. alone focused on retention requirements. And some of those are pretty granular that apply only to specific situations, but you may be in an industry that gets affected by that. And here again, that's why you need to go to your attorneys and ask for their guidance and counsel on exactly what you need to preserve and for how long it needs to be preserved.
Great. We've got another one here. I think there's a lawyer theme going, which is how fearful should I be that lawyers will request copies of emails? What are the chances nowadays?
The chance of an attorney requesting an email is actually pretty high, because email is involved in probably 3/4 of legal cases. They will request, certain types of email, from one individual to another, and so forth. What attorneys can't do, and I am not an attorney, and so I can't provide legal advice, obviously, but what attorneys can't do really is go on a fishing expedition and say, give me all of your emails for the past 3 years. The courts will very rarely allow something that broad. So you have to be fairly targeted, and the same is true with social media posts or any other type of content. But if a request is put forth that the court deems as reasonable, then the responding party is going to have to be able to gain access to those emails or present a very good case as to why they cannot do that.
And then looks like this is going to be our last question. Can you give me some examples of government regulations that are more common and that pop up more often?
Well, I mean, certainly from an archiving perspective, one of the real issues is, in the financial services industry is the preservation of communications with clients. So if you're a registered representative, for example, you have to preserve your communications that go out, I believe it's to 25 or more clients. So if you're advertising a new stock, or you're advertising in a mutual fund, what have you, and you're sending that out to your client base, that content always has to be preserved.
And any suggestions, this is truly the last one, any suggestions as to where I can go to find out more about what regulations we should be complying with?
Well, certainly, depending upon the industry, but the websites that I mentioned, and you might also want to go to vendors. I mean, Guava, I'm sure, has information on specific regulations that you need to focus on. As I mentioned, we have a white paper that you can download from our site in the white paper section that focuses on a variety of industries and the regulatory obligations to preserve content.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. Always, always great information as we have opportunity to spend time with you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Now, as a reminder, Guava has recently released a new version of its archiving product, Retain. This archiving solution securely archives mobile communications in addition to your email and social messaging data, and it all goes into one unified archive. The latest release includes Google Apps, Exchange 2013, smart tagging, policy-based end-user message deletion, and with the new Retain Mobile, Retain does communications archiving for Android and for BlackBerry. So for more information about Retain, visit us at www.guava.com. Thanks again, everyone, for being here. Please feel free to contact us, 1-866-GO-GUAVA, or email us questions at guava.com. And as a reminder to everybody on the call today, you will receive the Osterman Research White Paper, Best Practices for Managing Email Archiving. Thanks to you, Michael. Look for that email with the link and the download to this paper. Thanks, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and we'll see you soon.